When I woke up this morning, it was negative 10 degrees Celsius in the tent. My boots were frozen to the doormat, and my water was all solid. Hopefully, thinking back on the work I did in the heat of the summer will help me warm up. In my last letter, I talked about starting the work on the foundation for my forest camp with some less than professional lumberjacking, some line layout, and digging 13 holes in rubble disguised as soil. After the holes were dug, I started to take down the 2 diseased cherry trees that were hanging over the clearing for the tent. Unfortunately, they, and almost every other cherry in Nova Scotia, are infected with the black knot fungus, which causes the trees to grow large galls in their trunks. These then become weak points in high winds, and since I didn't want half a cherry tree crashing through my ceiling in the middle of the night, I decided to take them down.
Nice.
Then it was time to start getting ready to put in the posts. I started by creating a map of the site and labeled each post hole with a Roman numeral and the rough height of each post. Since the build site is on sloping, uneven ground, each of the posts would end up being a different length. The map was a simple way of keeping track of things. I made the posts from the 5 spruce trees that I felled when I was clearing the site, cutting each one about a foot longer than my measurements to give myself a margin of error. Then I started to strip the bark to help the posts resist rot. As I was stripping the bark, I carved the Roman numeral on each of the posts to match their position on the map. I picked that technique up from old timber framers who would carve Roman numerals into the point where joinery met so that they could keep track of the assembly. If you ever happen to find yourself in a pre-1900s barn, take a look at the spot where a post meets a beam, and you might see a marking there. I believe the reason they used Roman numerals is for ease of carving due to the straight lines. Arabic numerals would be harder to carve with their curves. That's my reasoning anyway. I was still enjoying the limited time I had left with the farm kittens before most of them went to their new homes.
Ow. Ow. That's my leg. That's my leg. Hey. This is my milk.
I wish I wasn't allergic, or I would 110% have a boat cat. My friends ended up keeping one of them and called him Truman after the sheriff on Twin Peaks. Truman is chunky. He looks like he ate his other siblings. He's bigger than his dad already, and he's only 8 months old. After the spruce logs were all stripped and marked, I began to treat the bottoms of the posts to prepare them for ground contact. The plan initially was to burn them with my propane torch, and then slather them in something called boat soup. It's a traditional wood finish that's equal parts oiled linseed oil, pine tar, and some sort of solvent, usually turpentine. Fortunately, since I had just cut the trees down last week, the posts were too wet to take a char. I just ended up using the boat soup on its own.
So you can see how only the heartwood is actually taking the char, which is because there's less moisture content in there. So all of the stuff, the big ring around it that hasn't charred is the sapwood, and that's where a lot of the moisture content is. It's going to take way too much energy to boil all that liquid out and create that char, so I'm just going to do pine tar.
I'm not really concerned about rot anyways. The soil here is so well draining and the posts are sheltered from the rain under the platform. Plus, I'll keep periodically applying boat soup at ground level, which is where rot usually happens on posts anyways. I know none of this is ideal, but it was cheap and it's what I had access to. And like I said last time, this is just a temporary structure. With the posts stripped and tarred, I started to set them in the ground. I started by putting a large convex rock in the bottom of each hole. This would help keep the end grain from direct contact with the soil, and also give it a bit of a footing. Then I set each post in its hole going one row at a time and used a laser level to plumb and align them. I backfilled the holes with stones and clay-rich soil, stopping every 6 inches or so to compact with the back of my landscape bar. The result by the time I was level with the ground was a nicely set post with very little movement. Most of the racking forces would be dealt with by bracing the posts to one another to make a cohesive structure. Why not use concrete? A, I felt it was too permanent. B, the green logs would have shrunk as they dried and pulled away from the concrete, leaving a gap for water to get in and pool. And C, cost. Once they were set, I used my laser level to draw a line at the exact same height across all of the posts, and then used my chainsaw to trim them all to that height.
Oh.
Two of the places where the posts were going to go were taken up by a carrying beam that I fastened to the spruce trunks using large structural screws. I essentially used the trunks as two more posts, and the carrying beam compensated for the fact that they weren't directly in line with the other posts. After everything was plumb and level, I started on the main carrying beams that would span the posts and support the floor joists. I had the 6x3 beams milled by a local sawyer out of Hemlock, but the 2x4 spruce joists, which are a little undersized for my liking, were salvaged from myself. I had actually built this structure before when me and my ex-partner bought our canvas wall tent in 2021. Like I said in my last letter, our plan unfortunately didn't work out, but she was kind enough to let me keep the tent. So, on a very rainy day in May, me and my friend dismantled the platform and dragged it back here so that I could rebuild it in my new home. I squared up the ends of the beams so that they would butt up against each other, and then positioned those joints over the middle post in each of the rows. Once they were in position, I traced an OG shape on the end of each beam to add a bit of a decorative element to the structure. I carved the rough shape out with my chainsaw, and then cleaned it up with a sculpting gouge. The gouge has a curved profile which cuts through the end grain nicely and leaves a hand-carved scalloped texture.
Who could have seen that coming?
I know it's a little silly, spending the extra time carving ornamentation into a structure that won't be here in 10 years, especially in such an inconspicuous place. But every time I see the evidence of my labor in something beautiful, it fills me with a little joy. I then fastened the beams to each of the posts with some large wood screws. With the main carrying beams in place, the next steps were to install the floor joists and the tongue and groove floorboards to finish the platform. Because they were salvaged from my last platform, they were a huge pain in the butt to install, but I'll get to that next time. I'm gonna go light a fire and try to warm up. Writing you from a tent near a boat in the woods, Joshua.